So, Bernardo, I'll just dive in with some stuff on meta consciousness, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. You mentioned that understanding of meta consciousness as being one of the fundamental distinctions that's hardest for many people to grasp about this model, a kind of barrier to the distinction having an experience and having the experience of knowing that you're having the experience. And it's distinct from intelligence. So you can be intelligent without knowing how the process arises, the kind of knowing of something. And in the course of that, you mentioned there's many different levels of metacognition. So maybe to kind of warm us up, but also to kind of flesh that out a bit, could you say a little bit more about what some of those levels might be?
You can be aware that you have an experience. So that's first level metacognition. You have an experience, and in addition to it, you are aware that you have the experience. But you can also be aware that you are aware of having an experience. And you can apply a recursion to this. You can be aware that you are aware that you are aware dot 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 that you're having an experience. And a lot of the movements of thought and emotion we have to do with these different levels of metacognition. For instance, it happens to many people, certainly happens to me. When you're in trouble, something terrible happens and you are in the throes of despair, there is a metacognitive part of you that sort of jumps out of that despair and then evaluates that with the awareness, oh, I am having this moment of despair. And it's amazing how I'm not going to use the word code, but how cool that can be, how sober that super meta conscious level can be, in the sense of just watching your own experiences far removed from the throes of the experience itself. So there can be many levels of metacognition. In psychology, especially depth psychology, they strive to higher and higher levels of metacognition, both in terms of the hierarchy of metacognition, whether you're conscious, that you're conscious, that you're conscious of, and so on, and also in terms of the volume of the mental contents that fall under the field of metacognition. The more of your own repressed thoughts and emotions you can bring under the lens of metacognition, the more mature you are, according to many approaches in depth psychology. A lot of talk therapy is, in fact, based on this idea that many of your problems can be solved if you bring those repressed thoughts, wishes, fears, and emotions to the light of metacognition. Because once you expose them to that light, they sort of lose a little bit their power because you see through the game. They are much more dangerous when you are experiencing them without knowing that you are experiencing them, because that's when they will play pranks on you, undermine you. The proverbial Freudian slip is an example of that. You have something running in the background that you're not aware that that experience is playing. It catches you in moments when you are, wrong-footed, and they betray things about you. So yeah, that's about it for levels of metacognition. I think there are. Well, let me go a little bit. Make one more comment. There are meditation exercises in Eastern traditions that are entirely focused on raising the level of metacognition. There are meditations in walking Zen in which the idea is for you to pay attention on every single movement and feeling that you do with a higher and higher level of metacognition. Like, I am moving my right foot. I am aware that I am moving my right foot. I'm aware of the feeling of being aware of moving my right foot. And there you go. They go down that path. And the idea is to sort of progressively take the inner subject out of the system, take that subject out of the maelstrom of thoughts and emotions, so all that can be observed from the outside, so you don't identify with them. You are not the fear, you are not the bad thought, you are not the regret. You are that observing the fear, the thought, the regret. So a lot of spiritual practices are based flat out on this idea of metacognition.
And so On the one hand, we have this, it kind of seems a little bit like mirrors facing each other. You can infinitely become more meta-conscious. Um, what's the difference between, because last week you said humans are perhaps the most meta-conscious dissociated alters in existence, and this is a source of a lot of their suffering. And at the same time, you mentioned here how in a spiritual tradition or in psychology, it's seen as a route out of suffering. So I don't know to what extent this is kind of related to your model specifically, but what do you see as the difference between, is it what you're meta-conscious of or how you're applying meta-consciousness that changes it from being a source of suffering to being a source of reduction in suffering?
Yeah, if you have no metacognition at all, then you can't even identify yourself as a individual subject. There is no you, there are only experiences, and experiences are intermingled between you and the world. I still remember when I was 11 years old, during a period of 11 or 9. I think I was mixing up when this happened with Jung. With me, it happened when I was 9. Um, I for 6 months, I had this realization repeatedly, like, I am not the world. Wow, I am me. I am not the world. And I remember having this cold shiver and sort of go down my spine, a very physical feeling like, whoa, this is amazing. And what was even more amazing was the idea that it has always been so. How could that possibly be? I mean, when you have an insight that gives you a shiver down your back, that happened. So before you develop metacognition, there is no you. There is only the world, the experience of the world. And you can't suffer because if there is no you, there is no narrative of what might happen to you. And there is no narrative about how bad it was, all that stuff that happened to you in the past. So without metacognition, you can't move to past and future. You can't have regrets. You can't have anxieties because you are in the moment. And in the moment, there is only pain. There is no suffering. Suffering is a narrative that makes us feel bad. Pain is something in the present moment. And it is surprising how tolerable pain is if you're not telling yourself a story about how bad the pain is. So even without metacognition, uh, pain is surprisingly tolerable if there isn't that narrative that, oh, it's never going to go away. I think it's getting worse. Oh, then you're lost. So you need a minimum level of metacognition to bring suffering into your life because you need to be able to metacognize enough to identify yourself as an individual separate from the world. And that individual has a narrative in the past and will have a narrative in the future. And it's those narratives that really crush you. Now, we have enough metacognition to suffer. The question is, do we then have enough metacognition to see through the suffering? And that's where the spiritual traditions come. So the thing is not monotonic. If you go from zero to some metacognition, suffering comes into the picture. But if you keep going in that metacognition, you can extract yourself so far away from the system of narratives that suddenly suffering also dissolves. It has happened to me a couple of times. It's not an abiding experience. Shortly afterwards, I'm back to the crap again. But it is possible. It is a kind of a strange loop, like Douglas Hofstadter would say, a strange loop that takes you out of the system, like a constant crescendo. And at some point, boom, you pop out of it. So yeah, it's not a clean thing that, if that, then that. No, no. If you get some metacognition, you will suffer. But if you keep going, if you don't sort of stay stuck on that place of suffering, then something special can happen. I haven't managed to make it a constant part of my life, but I have smelled it from close enough to know it's there.
Maybe one day we'll prescribe metacognition as in pill form. Gary last week was saying about language seeming necessary, a necessary tool of metacognition. So just wanted to get your perspective on how language interacts with metacognition. And he asks, is it does that also necessarily create fragmentation and division, subject from object, I, thou? Is it a necessary evil? Yeah, to what extent is language bound up with metacognition,
Oh,
um, and and the aspect of it that creates suffering or release from suffering?
I think the relationship is very intimate. I wouldn't be able to give you a clean model of exactly what it is. It's difficult to see which one is cause, which one is effect. They probably have a mutually causative relationship. They feed on each other, or they propel each other. But for you to develop language, you have to have symbolic thinking. In other words, you have to be able to think in terms of substitutes for real things and events. Because if you don't have a substitute, something that represents a thing or an event, you can only think about what is immediately available to you, which is probably how lower animals go about life. They only process what is immediately available to them. They can't refer to a tree that's not in their field of view. They can't refer to an event that happened in the past. But when symbolic thinking arises, we become able to use these labels, these representations, these pointers, instead of the things they represent, the things they point to. And this is, of course, intimately related to a step of metacognition, in which you use a sort of what Schopenhauer called a abstract representation, a representation of a thought, a representation of a feeling, which is that awareness of the thought, that awareness of the feeling. For instance, when you tell yourself, I am hungry in language, that's a metacognitive step. It's a moment of self-reflection that will lead to a path towards satiating that hunger. And that's how we construct our thoughts. We replace something that's present with a label in order to produce a sort of a future set of states that will lead to an effect on that present feeling. We can also use the same labels to refer to things that are already in the past or that are not even present yet. For instance, death, the concept of death is also largely based in language. How would we be able to think about our own death uh, without it? Because we haven't died yet. Death is not there. So you have to be able to think in these indirect terms. So I think there is a very intimate relationship between language and self-reflection, but I wouldn't be able to tell you in a clean way, which one comes first, if either, or what exactly the relationship entails.
And related to that, so in these meditation spiritual traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on increasing that metacognition of the present moment and seeing through narratives that can kind of take over our physiology as being merely narratives that are happening now and they're not actually happening. And in this moment, I feel like I'm aware that I was listening the last 2 minutes or whatever, I was just listening to your answer, but I'm now aware that I was seeing the whole time. My field of vision didn't go blank, but as I bring seeing into my metacognition, I'm seeing, and I'm now aware that I'm seeing. Uh, my field of vision feels much more detailed and vibrant and alive. It takes on a kind of high definition quality that doesn't seem to depend on me labeling the contents of my field of vision. Um, yeah, maybe you could just say how that experience relates to what you're talking about, if it does at any level.
Yeah, metacognition reinforces the intensity of experience. We can all relate to that. If you pay attention to a pain, it amplifies, and you can follow it amplifying. You can feel it growing. There is some kind of feedback mechanism when you have an experiential content, a metacognitive one that points to a lower level experiential content like the pain. It closes some kind of loop that amplifies the footprint of that original experiential content, and it tends to obfuscate other things as well. Things that are amplified through metacognition, which is another way to say the things that you're paying attention to. It would be the colloquial way of saying this. Attention is a metacognitive process. Where you put your attention, those experiences that receive your attention or that fall within the field of your attention, they get amplified to the cost of everything that is not in that field. How many times have I become completely metacognitively unaware of my hunger and thirst? as I was writing a book. I've lost count of the times that after hours I suddenly realized I'm drying up. I absolutely need to drink water. I'm hungry. I need to go to the toilet. So I was experiencing the hunger and the thirst and the need for a bio break all along, but they didn't fall in the field of my attention. What was being metacognitively amplified were my thoughts, and that came to the cost of those other experiences that I was nonetheless having all the time. They didn't suddenly pop out at some point. They were there all along.
And so related to this, the universal consciousness, um, maybe I need to just check I've understood the model a little bit. So as a dissociated alter, is it a two-way dissociation? In other words, the experience I'm having is not available to the transpersonal consciousness in the moment that I'm having it, because it's a two-way dissociation. Yeah.
Not every dissociation is two ways. There are, well, I have to say, anecdotal cases in the clinical literature. And I say anecdotal because they were not part of prospective studies. They were reported by patients. There was no controlled set of circumstances or anything. But there are rare cases in the clinical psychiatric literature in which people with dissociative identity disorders have alters that know nothing about the other alters, but the same person may have an alter that is aware of the inner life of another. And that is not two-way, that's only one way. So this exists as far as the anecdotal evidence allows us to infer, but it's not common. Usually, when you have dissociation, the break in the ability to make an inferential step goes both ways. Um, so my best guess is that for as long as we are alive, in other words, for as long as our dissociative process is running, I don't think mind at large is aware of what's happening in me. But of course, when that dissociation ends, which we call death, then there is commerce, because then there is no boundary anymore. Then the whole thing, no, there is absolute freedom for those mental contents to intermingle, and for inferential bridges to be built across what before were internal and external experiential states. That would be my best guess.
And this question came up in a few different forms last week about death. Um, and I think it relates to meta consciousness in the sense, people say, how come in a psychedelic state, or how come I'm not aware of everyone else's internal consciousness? So I feel like you've just answered that, but at a theoretical level, could mind at large be, what's the limit to how much? Okay, as an example, I feel I could be meta conscious. I'm seeing hundreds of colors in this moment. So it's not restricted in some way to one unit of information. Do you have a theoretical limit to this of what mind at large could, how much mind at large could be meta conscious of at the same time? For example, all the inner contents of our lives after we have died simultaneously.
I don't think mind at large has the ability to originate from within itself a metacognitive insight. I think metacognition is something that has arisen through evolution. It's the payoff of life on this planet. It's a bloodbath, it's a carnage, and this is the payoff. This is what all the crap is about. Um, that said, if you are a living being and you have developed all kinds of metacognitive insights and then you die, in other words, your dissociative boundary dissolves, those insights of a metacognitive nature are now seated in a broader context. I don't think mind at large can generate new ones, but I think the metacognitive insights that one has had, they don't disappear because of the end of a dissociative boundary. The insight is itself an experiential state. It may have a reason because of a metacognition, because of an ability of a certain dissociated alter's mind to fold in upon itself. And that may be a unique topology of consciousness that gave rise to that experiential state. But once the state is in there, it no longer depends on the ability of developing new metacognitive insights for it to continue to exist. The insight is itself an experience, even if it has a reason from metacognition. So I think mind at large, by now, after what, 3.5 billion years of life, let's say that metacognitive life has been going on 2 million years at least since the gender Homo has arisen. So Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, and all those. I think we have very good reasons to believe that elephants are metacognitive to quite a large extent. So are dolphins and other cetaceans. So let's say this has been going on for 2 million years. It's a lot of metacognitive insights that have been seeded out there by now. They may be mutually contradictory. You know, the truth has many facets, and when you project the truth and you only look at the shadow, shadows may contradict each other. But from that perspective, I think there's a lot of metacognitive insights out there, but not the ability to give rise to new metacognitive insights outside the scope of living creatures.
Okay, great. So I'll just do a couple more questions in this direction, and then I see a couple of other hands up, and then we'll kind of open that out. And maybe, and I'm just thinking out loud here, because originally it was like, oh, I'll introduce all of last week's questions, and then we'll do questions. But then by the time we get to that, it might feel like we've moved on. So maybe it's better to do like little sections. So related to this, there's the metacognition of a content of experience. So I can be meta-conscious of the color. I can be seeing the color and aware that I'm seeing the color. And then there's awareness of awareness itself, irrespective of what I'm aware of. There's this idea that not only am I aware of content, I'm aware that I'm aware of content. And in some spiritual traditions, this is considered a part of what they call awakening, or a step in that direction at least, and related to diminishment in psychological suffering. So yeah, but it would be just great to get your perspective on that. There's not like I'm not sure how to form that into a question.
I think the way increased levels of metacognition may lead to a form of liberation from suffering is by realizing that even the so-called individual self is itself a narrative, that it doesn't really have existence. And can you arrive at that state through metacognitive exercises? I think we can. I mean, I have a good friend, Rupert Spira, who a large part of his teaching is precisely following this path. Because you see, when you're not metacognitive and you are hungry, you are the hunger. There is no you outside from the hunger. And then when you are metacognitive and you think symbolically in linguistic terms, you are the one who has the hunger. You're not the hunger anymore. You are the one feeling the hunger. That's a metacognitive step. Now, if you keep going in that direction, you get to a point where you realize what I thought I realize now was the narrative of the one who experienced the knowledge of being hungry, if you know what I mean. It's very hard to give you a conceptually clear and unambiguous description of what I'm referring to. That's why it takes spiritual exercise. Otherwise, everybody would be there. I would write a paper, publish it in a journal. 7 billion people would download it, and everyone would be enlightened. So that ultimate metacognitive step is not amenable to unambiguous characterization through concepts and words. But you can think of it, you can gain an intuition for that by thinking about it in terms of every step of the way you remove yourself from a context of identity. And then you fall into another context of identity. And then you apply metacognition again, and you remove yourself one more step, and you fall in another context of identity. And then you apply that again. Eventually, you will fall out of every possible context of individual identity, and you realize that you are the one who is coming up with those contexts of individual identity. You are making the whole thing up and experiencing what you make up. And that's why metacognition can take you out of that. When you realize that the experience of identity is the experience of making up a narrative, when you remove yourself enough steps from the system, from that context of identity to realize this, something special happens. And no, I am not there. I've wetted my toes a couple of times, enough to know it is there. All right, it's not BS. It's there. Um, but 48 hours later, I'm like, what was that again? What exactly? How exactly did I feel? Why did they conclude this? And I don't know anymore.
I remember in your talk, you at Psychedelic Society, it was a few years now, you equated real enlightenment or liberation as probably synonymous with death. I'm hearing that maybe you've tasted something now that maybe you, you, you might accept there's some kind of state of metacognition that if it's well trained enough can endure in this lifetime. Am I interpreting you incorrectly? Or
Death is the end of the dissociation, and then narratives of the individual self are not tenable anymore. It's like a waking up from a dream and trying to think that you are still the dream character. It's completely untenable. There are certain things that once they are seen through, you cannot unsee them. So you cannot, during the dream, you think you are that dream character, and then you wake up and you're like, oh, but maybe I'm still the dream character. No, you you woke up. That story is not tenable anymore. So death is sort of forceful enlightenment, whether you want it or not, because you cannot believe the narrative of individual self for the same reason that you can't believe in your dream avatar after you wake up. I mean, you know it existed as an experience, but you no longer identify with it. The identification becomes untenable. Now the question is, that's the path of ending the dissociation. It's not enlightenment. It's the path of ending the dissociation. You could compare that to experiences of no self during a psychedelic experience because they are the best models of death we have. They basically squash your default mode network, which is what gives you that sense of individual self. The drug just smashes brain activity in that network, and then you're still experiencing. There is still a I, in the sense there is still an experiencer, but you come back, and if you still remember what you just experienced, you know that that had nothing to do with an individual self. It's a fairy tale, the story of an individual self. Now, there may be another path which is not related to ending the dissociation, like death and high dose psychedelic experiences, but related to higher and higher and higher levels of metacognition. So Rupert Spira is not trying to get you to a state of that Buddhists would call the void, the no self experience. He's trying to get you to, while still in a dissociated state, to see through the dissociation by removing yourself ever in ever more steps of stepping back from that context of identity, without um, without impairing the dissociation, um, but from within the dissociation, climbing the ladder of metacognition. And I don't think the experience is in any way similar to the experience of no self that you get from psychedelic experience or death. I don't think it's similar to that at all, but it clearly uh, points to the exact same conclusion in a completely different way.
and it sounds related to a part of the perspective that you bring, and it's used as a metaphor in some of these spiritual traditions of its being similar to a wave being identified with its form as a wave, and then recognizing there's no part of itself that isn't water. It is the ocean in the action of waving, but it's not really a wave. It's made of water. And similarly, I am not. Um, I'm not this form. This is a form in consciousness, but there's no part of it that isn't consciousness. I am consciousness, and that identification can shift at some level, and with it comes certain liberation. So the distinction you're making is that being a constant metacognitive awareness in day-to-day experience that would be synonymous with what Rupert Spira is indicating.
Yes, and I think both states lead to the same conclusion. But maybe I can use a metaphor that everybody would recognize, at least people who have had um, lucid dreams. Um, the spiritual self-inquiry path, which is the path of, take ever more steps back from the context of identity through metacognition, that would be equivalent in my metaphor to your dream avatar meditating until the dream becomes lucid. You're still in the dream, but I'm dreaming. Know what I mean? You're still in the dream. You're still dissociated from the rest of your mind, which is creating the rest of your dream. The dissociation is intact. You're fully immersed in the dreamscape still. But now you're lucid. And what is lucidity? Lucidity is metacognition. And we know scientifically that most ordinary dreams uh, uh, lack almost all metacognition. We only become metacognitively aware of a dream after we wake up by using the mirror of memory. So it's only through the mirror of memory that we can metacognize a dream. But when you are in the dream, you're not metacognitive. A lucid dream is when you suddenly become metacognitive in the dream. So a spiritual path of self-inquiry is your dream avatar meditating until it realizes, I'm dreaming. Now, the smash your default mode network psychedelic trip and death would be equivalent to just plain waking up. Know what I
Mm.
mean? It's
Yeah,
the end of
the
the
end of the dream.
dissociation. You
Yeah.
didn't become lucid within the dream. You quit the dream altogether.
Mm.
What is death but quitting this dream, right? It's very natural. So I would say, yeah, death is forced enlightenment in the sense that you're taken out of the system. You woke up. You can't help. Psychedelic experiences are the best model for that you can have while still being able to return to the dream. It's like you wake up in the middle of the night for 3 seconds and you fall asleep again. But during those 3 seconds, the dissociation ended. You did wake up. You just fell asleep again and went back to the same dream, which has happened to me many times. And the spiritual self-inquiry path is you don't wake up, not in this metaphor. You wake up in another way, in the sense that you wake up within the dream. Your dream becomes lucid, but you're dreaming and you're going merrily on with it still.
And so, just for those waiting, I'll just make this the last follow-up question, and we'll take questions from others. Um, to what extent do you see? So there's the experience of waking up, but it sounds like you have a intellectual, you're very convinced intellectually that this is a dream. But it sounds like you distinguish that from the kind of spiritual path, which is experienced at maybe at a different level. Or could you say more about, like, would you see this path of this philosophical inquiry that you do ending up in the same place, or is it somehow, okay, I can be intellectually very rigorously convinced that everything is consciousness, but it's a little bit different from, let's say, a spiritual path, let's say, that Rupert Spira would take, where,
It's different.
yeah, what's the distinction there?
Well, philosophy is not transformative. A spiritual path that leads to direct experience is transformative. It's knowing with your whole body. Philosophy is conceptual. My whole game is helping people give themselves intellectual permission to explore the path of direct experience, because in our culture, that path has become associated with stupidity, which is it's a cultural tragedy if there has ever been one. And look, I am far from an enlightened being. I cannot play the role of Rupert Spira. I just don't have it in me, and I can't do that. So the role I try to play is the cultural role. It's the role of fighting with a narrative, fighting with words and logical reasoning, conceptual steps, empirical evidence. It's the objective discourse. And there are two weapons for that discourse. One is reasoning, and the second is empirical evidence, and I use both. But of course, there is the third thing, which is introspection, and that's the spiritual path, the path of self-inquiry. It's introspection as opposed to objective reasoning and objective evidence. Only introspection is transformative, but you cannot get there through introspection if your intellect is telling you this is nonsense. And we have our whole culture now clamoring towards us. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Don't take it seriously. It's a mirage. You're being cheated. Don't go there. You're wasting your time. use your life in another way. Yeah, it's very difficult. So you see, I am highly convinced that only abiding direct experience can really be transformative. Why am I convinced of that? Because if philosophy could do that, I wouldn't be suffering by now. You know what I mean? So clearly, philosophy will not do. It's not enough. But I consider myself to be in a highly privileged position compared to a lot of people I know who are equally not there, but who are intellectually completely closed to the path. They will not even get on it. And if you can't even get on the path, what hope do you have? So I have more hope for myself than I have for a lot of people I know. And I don't say this with arrogance. I say this like, well, I played the lottery at least. I can still win. These guys didn't even play. They have no chance. So, and I think our culture plays an enormous role in closing the path for the vast majority of people because the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. What the intellect doesn't respect, the heart doesn't feel. It's filtered out.
Great, beautiful. So let's go to some questions. If you're able, people asking questions, to stay more or less on this theme, because then I'll kind of come back to the other themes that people have emailed in and from the chat last week, and then there's some coherence here. And do your best to restrict yourself to one follow-up question if you can, related to the same thing, just to give more people a chance to get their questions in. And yeah, welcoming Stuart. Stuart's a friend and a meditator. If you want to unmute yourself and
Hi there. Hi,
Hi, Stu.
Bernardo. I had some thoughts whilst reading the first section of you decoding Schopenhauer's metaphysics. I started using that book to get a better grasp of precisely how you were framing metacognition. And some things that came up for me in the first half of the book, you mentioned that some experience, first person experience, is prior to conceptualization. And it sort of provoked some sort of introspection of how Buddhism and various forms of Vedanta seem to use a spectrum from our most sort of solid sense of experience through in 5 steps or 7 steps in a color-coded system through to our host experience of the knower of experience. And I just wondered, my immediate sort of thoughts were that the Buddhists and the Vedantists were going into this prior to conceptualization, and then they were giving themselves a 5-step program or a 7-step program to move from a first-person experience almost through to a fourth-person experience. With sort of finishing with the sort of subtler elements of the host awareness of spaciousness, starting with the most solid sort of concept of the most substantial earth element through a spectrum. It seemed a much more logical way to go from our sense of separateness through to our sense of unity in this sort of spectrum. And it also made me think that, okay, people can rush into the sort of non-dual or the Zen experience, but at some point, maybe they have to come back and move through a color-coded sense of mysticism, similar to sort of maybe Jung's mundus imaginalis, that there's a color coding to the mundus imaginalis. In a way. So I just wondered whether you have had also any thoughts in trying to reconcile the unitive experience with our sense of the most intimate sensations and the sort of spectrum that exists in between it that could possibly be being referred to by people like Jung and Henri Corbin as a color-coded mundus imaginalis.
I don't recall a color code in Jung's corpus, but Jung's corpus is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be the first one to believe that I missed something. Are you referring to psychology and alchemy?
I guess maybe if participating in a pantheistic spirit paradigm, say through sort of Hinduism or maybe a sort of Santeria Umbanda, where they have a very colourful set of archetypes going all the way through from warlike archetypes, love-like archetypes to sort of unitive archetypes. And if you wanted to simplify, you could say, oh, well, they more or less follow into groups of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jung would say there is indeed a gradation towards individuation in Jung's analytic psychology. The first confrontation is the archetype of the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
So the things about you that you don't want to know about yourself, you're not metacognitive of those aspects of yourself, even though they are experienced, and that's why they can influence your life. If you pass the shadow, then there is the confrontation with the anima for the man or the animus for the woman, which is the soul in Jungian psychology, the sort of the doorkeeper of the collective unconscious. You have to pass through that archetype. And then once you are in the collective unconscious, then there is a collective shadow. For instance, Nazism is a manifestation of a collective shadow.
Okay.
And then beyond the collective shadow, which in Catholicism is the devil, then you meet the archetype of the self, which is the union, the reconciliation of our opposites at a completely transpersonal level. The self is not you as an individual. The self is something that transcends all boundaries of identity. So in Jungian therapy, there is indeed this gradation of confronting progressive layers of things that are either not metacognized or which are outright dissociated. When you get to collective level, we are talking about outright dissociation, not only obfuscation or lack of metacognition. There is something bigger happening. So yes, I recognize that, and I recognize in the world's many spiritual traditions that there is this approach of doing it in phases. It gives you a sense of progress. I also recognize that there are many people there who say, this is the ultimate trap. There are no phases. Either you see it or you don't. You see it now or you don't see it. End of story.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to sympathize with the latter, because the couple of times I sort of dipped my toe in flat out transpersonal state, it didn't come as the culmination of a systematic progress through mileposts. It didn't happen. Milestones. It didn't happen like that. It just boom happened. And in Christian tradition, you would call that grace. And that's why you don't get to decide when grace comes to you. Grace is a gift of God in the Christian tradition. So it echoes this idea that it is not a progressive path. It happens or it doesn't happen. And for as long as it doesn't, it just doesn't. And by the way, it can happen to somebody who never engaged in any spiritual path. It just, boom, it happens. Now, are there laws behind this? Are there laws? Are there patterns and irregularities in the behavior of mind at large, ourselves, that would allow us to model this? Why does it happen suddenly in some cases? In other cases, it happens after a long progression. I think there are those regularities, and I think they are in principle amenable to being identified and understood. Are we anywhere near that understanding today? Not at all. I think we are as far from that understanding as cavemen were from understanding atomic reactors, the fissure of the atom. It's very, very far away from our ability to comprehend with our current cognitive apparatus. But I think it is, in principle at least, a manifestation of a process that in principle can be understood. It's just that we are not there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's interesting. I had one other little question about the concept of a muse, or if we are making our way across this assault course or this territory. Is this the overlap of the muse, some sort of partial permeable overlap, similar to the big overlap when we die and wake up, but in life are we also being visited in a muse-like guidance way, as a way of making our way through this color-coded swamp or mundus imaginalis, which depending on which you're in the deep end or the shallow end.
Look, there is the muse and there is the daimon. Both have existed forever in Western philosophy, and equivalent ideas exist in every philosophical tradition in this world. What are they? What are the muse and the daimon? They are the call of the transpersonal as experienced by the personal. They are the movements of the currents and the waves of the ocean in which we see ourselves as a little boat. We don't really get to choose where we are going. We don't get to choose as individuals where we are going. There is a push and a pull of a transpersonal nature. And our only choice is, do I resist or do I comply? And I think that's the essence of freedom. The essence of freedom for me is surrender to the daimon. I have no control over my life. And for a long time, I was in total revolt against this. In other words, I was trying to wrestle control of my life. And every time I realized I actually don't have any control, it pissed me off or made me depressed. For me, freedom was only achieved when, and since we're talking, I paraphrased Christianity already, freedom from me only comes when you are able to sincerely say to yourself, thy will be done, not mine. Then you're free. Then finally you're free. And at the same time, you're more enslaved and shackled than ever. if you see what I mean. It's when you surrender to the slavery that you are free. There is a profound truth in this apparent contradiction. And this overwhelming influence of the transpersonal or even the impersonal, because that energy, that force, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't give a damn about whether you're happy or depressed. It doesn't give a damn about you achieved your little toy goals in life. It couldn't care less whether you're healthy or sick. It has an agenda, and that agenda is completely impersonal, and you are just an instrument. For as long as you think of yourself as an individual, then you have to think yourself as an instrument. Of course you are not. You are just it. You are not an individual. You are it, emotion. The slavery comes when you think of yourself as an individual. Then you're lost, unless you surrender, which is what I do. I'm not enlightened, so I still see myself as an individual. But I am a free individual in the sense that I have surrendered to slavery. So this transpersonal force, it can either push or pull. When it pulls, it's the muse. It's the artist's muse. It's the object of the most profound love and attraction that can be. It's the irresistible call of the siren. It's the siren song. You cannot resist, you go towards it. When it pulls, it's the daimon. It kicks you on the butt. It will make you sick if it needs to make you. It will destroy you. It will make you vulnerable to the point that you cannot resist what it wants you to do. You will do its bidding one way or the other. It may cost you your life, but you may die. You may not do it in the sense that you end up dying, but you either die or you will do it. When it manifests itself this way, it's the daimon. It's Socrates' daimon, who every time told him what not to do. Every time Socrates would think, okay, I'm going to go that way. No, not that way. It wouldn't tell Socrates what to do, but it would tell him everything that shouldn't be done. And then by a process of elimination, you get kicked in the butt in the right direction eventually. Artists usually have the muse, the irresistible siren song that they have to follow. And then many have died in the process of following that. but they did their bidding. So they didn't die for nothing. For philosophers, it tends to be the daimon. I have the daimon. I don't have a muse. I go kicking and screaming all along the way. All along the way.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bernardo. Next we have Jane. You've also written your question in the chat, so if you prefer, I'll read it, but if not, you feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I'll go, unless I hear you, I can't see everyone, so I'll go ahead and read it.
Hello, no, I'm there now.
Great.
Hello, Bernardo.
Hi there.
Hi, it's Jane who keeps posting silly messages on your So last week, Bernardo, you said regarding life after death, because that's my favorite topic, that when you die, you think that the individual Bernardo doesn't, or you intuit that the individual Bernardo doesn't carry on. Similar, I think the analogy you used was when you wake up from a dream, your dream character doesn't carry on. So what I want to know is, do you think that when you die, your experience will be exactly the same as my experience? And, you know, you've likened death to a psychedelic experience. So are we all going to experience the same psychedelic experience when we die?
Well, the evidence, ambiguous as it is, suggests that that's not the case, at least in that transition phase from which some certain people seem to have returned. You seem to be experiencing a lot of what you carry with you. The energy you carry with you, the state of mind you carry with you, that place in your psychological development from which you started that journey of transition, that sort of gets mirrored back to you. So I would say that based on whatever evidence we think we have, at least in the early stages of that sort of reconfiguration of consciousness, in which the dissociation, if it doesn't end, at least it's highly weakened, let's put it that way, weakened to the point that no image is left behind because our bodies eventually decompose. At least in the early stages of that, it's not the same. Now, if you ask me, what about the ultimate stage of that, when you are in oceanic awareness, then I would say, per force, we will have the same experience because we are the same. There is no way we couldn't have the same experience when all dissociation ends, because there is only the one subject that's going on that is left. And then the question is, does physical death entail that you will necessarily get to that oceanic awareness state? Or is there some intermediary level of dissociation that does not have a physical correlate, that does not have a physical body? It is coherent to think that there may be intermediate states in which you are no longer your individual self that you give a name to in this life, but you are also not everyone else. You are something in between. It's coherent to think that might be the case because our sensory apparatus evolved to give us a survival advantage. It didn't evolve to see everything in nature that our philosophy may consider relevant or salient. So if there is a state of dissociation that cannot interfere with the rest of the physical goings on in the world, then there would be no necessary reason, there would be no reason for the sensory apparatus of living beings to perceive a alter in that intermediate state, because that alter cannot help or endanger the life of those still experiencing full dissociation.
And just finally, what's your view on reincarnation?
It's the same answer. I think the the evidence for reincarnation can also be explained by appealing to the end of dissociation. If my mental contents are freed in the sense that they are dispersed in the broader context of mind that surrounds us upon my death, when my dissociation ends, then it's conceivable that people who have a more or less permeable dissociative boundary can pick those things up. They can pick up my memories. And then people say, well, then Bernardo is alive on the other side. Well, Bernardo is alive in the sense that Bernardo is the one subject going on, and so is everybody else, and that subject has nowhere to go. So yeah, in that sense, Bernardo is alive. But is Bernardo alive as the dream avatar? I would say no, but the memories of the dream avatar may still be accessible, and that may be what people are picking up. Having said that, for all I know, it may be the case that upon our physical death, we sort of fall back to a broader state. It's still dissociated, but it's a broader dissociation, which has no physical correlates. In other words, it can't by nature be picked up by the sensory organs that living beings have evolved, because it has no bearing on survival. So there was no need to evolve a way to pick that up. And that sort of intermediate level of dissociation may sprout another alter at some point, for all I know. So I think it is conceptually coherent to imagine that this can be possible. It is conceivable in a coherent way that this may be possible. Why don't I talk about it a lot? Because I don't think the question of what might be possible is very interesting. There are infinite things that might be possible and that cannot be disproven based on our reasoning and the evidence we have. I think the important question is, what do we have reasons to believe in? And I feel quite divided about whether we have reasons to believe in an intermediary level of dissociation that endures after my physical death. And it could be that I am biased in that, because I very much wish that there isn't. And this is a reflection of my own anxieties and history, whatever. But there might be, for all I know. I don't know.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Apologies if I pronounce this incorrectly, Gert?
Yes, thank you. So, good evening, everyone, and good evening, Bernardo.
Hi.
It's lovely to be part of this, and I would like to tie a few things from last week's session together with today. And last week I've heard a few things that you were advocating that made my soul smile, because, well, in general, I appreciate that you bring something precious to my life, which is the ability to reason to friends that are not on a spiritual path, but who are still interested in the nature of reality, and to find, well, you are offering a way to have a conversation with them that they don't think that I'm cuckoo. So that's much appreciated. Last week, you mentioned two types of idealists. One flavor who is actually assuming that there is nothing like the world, so it's all an illusion. It's just we're making it up. And then you seem to advocate that there is something out there. So there is a form of the world, whatever we can understand under that. At some point, you also mentioned, and we have been speaking about Rupert Spira today, Advaita Vedanta. And I would say that Advaita Vedanta is one tradition which actually says that the world is an illusion. So Advaita Vedanta is saying that the world is something we need to see through, but basically it's illusory. And well, first of all, I would like to make a suggestion as something that you may want to look into. And secondly, I have a question. So the suggestion is that next to Advaita Vedanta, there is another tradition in the same culture, which we could call Advaita Tantra. So I'm not speaking about Neo Tantra. So it's lovely to have great sex, but Neo Tantra has actually very little to see with the tradition. Another name for the Advaita Tantra could be Kashmir Shaivism, which is one of the best known schools in classical Tantra, or Trika philosophy. So actually, Kashmir Shaivism is a very elaborate and intricate philosophy, and you're a philosopher. Now, what I think is very interesting in this tradition for you is that I've heard you say a number of things that are actually much closer to Advaita Tantra than to Advaita Vedanta. And one of them I have already mentioned. Another one is that you have been speaking about vibrations and levels of vibration, and that everything is basically vibration. And that's exactly what Tantra is saying, that the world is vibratory. One could also say, and that's also typical for the Vedic tradition, that the world is sonic, actually, that everything is a product of sound. And what actually Advaita Tantra is saying is that the world, as we know it, is actually an emission out of pure awareness. So it does exist, but it is divine, and it's actually a progressive emission, and that the material things that we can touch are like the final stage of that process of emission. And the traditional, I mean, the practice of meditation, transcendent meditation, is actually tracing back yourself along the same movement of emission, but you're just making the reverse movement. And by that, you are finding your divine source again. So just a suggestion that maybe you want to look closer into that tradition, because it's very elaborate and intricate. So that's just what I wanted to share. And then, which is also typical for Tantra, actually, and that's my question, is we've been speaking about the witnessing state, for example, so that what you call metacognition. And what Tantra pays a lot of attention to in its philosophy and in its teaching are the what we could call the various gradations in perception, and there's this distinction that is being made between subject and object. So obviously, subject is the self, and object is everything we experience. And then the process of awakening and the process of unfoldment of consciousness towards enlightenment is actually a progression from being totally absorbed in the object, which is the state of 95% of the population probably, going into what someone like Maharishi called cosmic consciousness, which is the witnessing state, where one is actually already established in the self, or self-realized, one could say, to various gradations, and actually from there witnessing the world, so the objective reality. And then actually what happens when there's complete unity is that one is no longer absorbed by the object, one is no longer in the witnessing state, but actually one has reabsorbed the world into the self. So basically in that state, one is simply recognizing the world as oneself. And there is no distinction anymore, which is still there in cosmic consciousness, for example, in the witnessing state. So that's my question, maybe for you to elaborate a little bit on this continuum of subject-object relationship, and what is out there today in terms of scientific research in exactly that tension between subject and object.
Let me see what the best angle is to approach, because your question was rich. You brought a lot of things forward. I think the individual self, I mentioned this earlier today, it arises through metacognition, in the sense that for as long as you are the pain, you are the hunger, you are the cold, for as long as you are the feeling, there is no individual self. The individual self arises when you say, I have the hunger, I feel cold, I am in pain. That's the birth of the individual self. But if you keep on applying metacognition to that, it will come to the point where you say, I am the witness of the narrative of self. And that would then be what you refer to as cosmic consciousness. But of course, this still happens within the boundaries of a dissociative process. So you are not the world in the sense that you don't really identify with the world from a felt perspective, because you are dissociated from the world, but you've achieved a level of insight through this recursive application of metacognition, which in spiritual circles is called self-inquiry. And the oceanic awareness then of not being only cosmic consciousness, but identifying with the world, then you have to pierce the boundary of the dissociation. Then you have to see the world from the other side, because whatever is out there, it presents itself to us as the world. But that is an image of something else, of its inner essence. When you attain acquaintance with that which is behind the image, that inner essence that projects the image, when you shortcut that boundary and you become acquainted with what is behind the image, then you are the world. Nisargadatta said, to see God is to see the world. There is no seeing God apart from the world. To see God beyond the world is to be, no, yeah, to see God beyond the world is to be God. So basically what he's saying is, for as long as you're seeing the world, that's the image projected by God or your transpersonal self. To understand God beyond the image that is projected, you have to be God. You cannot be, your relationship with it cannot be intermediated by images. There are psychedelic states in which people describe exactly that. Actually, the very first psychedelic trip of my girlfriend was that. She was staring out the window and I asked her, what are you seeing? And she said, I am experiencing what's behind all that. And I was just floored, because that's a conclusion I had arrived at conceptually. And there she was, an artist, just telling me like it's nothing, like it's the most obvious thing in the world. Regarding scientific evidence, when we say that the world is illusory, all that we mean is that the world isn't what it appears to be, or isn't what we conceptualize it to be. But there is never a denial of the experiences we call the world, because they are experiences and they exist as such. The problem is when you try to hang a conceptual definition under that experience and you say, those experiences are experiences of a material reality outside and independent of consciousness. Now, that may be wrong. And in that sense, the world may be an illusion insofar as you hang that conceptual explanation under the experience. But the experience itself exists. What I mentioned last time was that even if you acknowledge the existence of the experience, you can go in two ways about it. You can say those images are images of something transpersonal that lies behind the images, or you can say nothing lies behind the images. I am projecting the images and they only exist insofar as they are images projected by me or images projected by you. In other words, there is nothing hanging or nothing existing behind the images. There is only something in front of the images, you projecting the images. This would be akin to a metaphor of a dream. When you dream at night, there's nothing behind those images in principle, insofar as we know. There's nothing behind those images. There's only your mind conjuring up those images. The images only exist as such, as images. Is the same applicable to the world? Or is there some transpersonal reality outside me, independent of me, that is projecting those images from behind, as opposed as from my perspective? I think the latter is true. I think there is something objective out there, I call it mind at large, something outside all alters, which appears to us in the form that we call the physical world. So the physical world is a representation of a transpersonal reality that is really out there. It isn't physical, because physicality is how we describe the images, is the numbers we attach to the images in order to predict how the image will evolve in time. That's what we call physicality. It's length, breadth, weight, mass, frequency. These are descriptions of images, the images we can see around, whether aided by instrumentation or not. But I think there is something behind the images, which by definition is non-physical, because otherwise, if it were physical, it would be in the images. There is something non-physical, something of the nature of unambiguous thought, which lies behind the images and which project the images upon observation. So it's our interaction with this something transpersonal that gives rise to the phantasmagoria in the screen of perception, the things we see, smell, hear, touch, and so on. Now, since very recently, I take the other alternative, that the images are just that, they are just images, there's nothing transpersonal behind them. I take this alternative slightly more seriously, since only very recently, because there is a physicist, I still don't want to name him, eventually he will be named because I just recorded something with him yesterday. He's a member of a National Academy of Sciences, and he says, and he argues very compellingly for it, that if the world is just an inferential projection we make, there's nothing really out there. It's just we as observers. And then he doesn't go into the philosophy, but a direct implication of what he's saying is the observer is a mind. He will not say that to you. He will stay neutral, as he should, as a physicist, but it's a direct implication of what he's saying. It's our minds that project the world. And we seem to be in the same world because through, how do I say this in a non-mathematical way? You know what the concept of induction? You can deduce things or you can induct things.
Mm-hmm.
You deduce something smaller from a bigger set, and you can induct a broader reality from a few occurrences. Like if you've seen stones falling down every time they're released from a hand, and you've seen that 100,000 times, then by inferential induction, you can say it will happen on the 101,000th time. Because it has always been so, then it will be so in the future. That's induction. So what he says is that minds are by nature inductive machines. They try to, through induction, infer something around them. And there is a mathematical principle that shows you that you will always try to infer something that can be explained from what you inferred before. There is a natural tendency to this kind of coherence in induction. What you will project out there will always be the possibility that's mostly explainable on the basis of what you have experienced before. So this induction process will naturally tend to a form of order, to regularities, which we describe according to laws of physics. So by taking this step, he's saying, through natural induction, I would perforce always end up in an understandable universe that can be modeled according to the laws of physics. Well, great. He eliminated one reason to believe in a transpersonal reality, and that is that we would mathematically always tend to infer a regular reality just by induction. The other point he made is that suppose that you exist in my world. So you are a result of my inductive process. You appear to me in the form that I find most explainable to myself. Now, will my world then be consistent with your world? Because you're doing the same. You're also constructing a world through induction. And he can show that these two probabilities will converge. They will be the same. The world you will project will tend to be the same as the world that I will project in order to see you in my world. And if I were to talk to you, we would both agree we are in the same world, even though we are both making it up.
But
So
that does not imply necessarily that what is being induced and created is illusory and non-existent.
Well, what do we mean by illusion? Illusion just means it's not what it seems to be, or it's not what we think it to be, but as an experience, it exists. There is a world we experience. It's undeniable. Now, does this world correspond to empty images that we project ourselves, Or do these images arise from some transpersonal reality that lies behind the images? And his point is that we can actually come up with a mathematical argument that makes it conceivable that there is no such transpersonal reality. There are only the alters. There is no mind at large. And the alters are part of universal consciousness, but there is no common context in which they are all immersed, which is not itself part of an alter. I am still not all the way with him, because I think the very conceptualization of my probability and your probability, the moment I say that you exist, and he's assuming that when he tries to argue that your world would tend to be just like mine, he's accepting your existence. I think that two observers exist almost implies or almost entails even that they have to exist in a broader context, and therefore there is something transpersonal. It may be a minor, insignificant conceptual point. I still hold to my own position, 99%. I'm just sharing with you that over the past couple of weeks, I am curious about the mathematics showing that there could actually be something else going on. It doesn't change idealism. It's still all in mind. It only reinforces idealism. This physicist identifies publicly as an idealist. He says that outright. It's just that his notion of idealism is more mathematical and less philosophical. So I find it intriguing, but if you ask me, you have to bet your eternal bliss or eternal damnation. Which of these two options is true? I will go all in. I will go for broke on there actually being a transpersonal world out there, which we perceive through the imagery we call physicality.
Well, me too so far. So thank you. And I would like to just conclude by suggesting that there might be something illogical in one thing that you said, which is that you have spoken about thy will be done, and then you have said that this is a form of slavery. Maybe it was just tongue-in-cheek, but now that you shared what Nisargadatta actually shared, which is falling back in divinity and actually by becoming God, then thy will be done is a continuous divine action, and there is no slavery in being God.
Of course. If there is only one subject, who is this subject a slave of? Right.
And there's also actually a perfect explanation why you say that I have been in touch with these glances of what we could call unity, and then after 48 hours it's gone. It's actually, I think, because again, looking at vibration, that you simply don't have the neurophysiological vibration to hold that level of consciousness. And that's also an aspect of classical tantra, which is not looking at self-inquiry as the prime tool for realizing the self, but actually doing practices which are inducing a neurophysiological transformation to refine your neurophysiology in such a way that you are able, in holding increasingly fine levels of and expanded levels of consciousness. So just another, yeah.
I was saying it's tongue-in-cheek about slavery, and at the same time not, because it feels very much like slavery. But you see, our individual selves are illusions in the sense that they are not really there. It's a construct of our minds, and the diamond is me, and so is the muse. There's nothing beyond that. But insofar as I do identify with my individual self, which happens 99% of the time, in that illusory context, it feels like slavery. Yes, totally, completely. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Very nice. Sri, if your questions are relevant, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is. So Bernardo, we've been using multiple terms to refer to mind, consciousness, awareness, ego. And I mean, for me, they seem to be distinct things. And in many ways, we kind of slip into one and the other. So I wanted to understand if you have a specific definition for these? Are they different? I clearly see some differences in each of these terms, right? The second question I have, follow-up of that, is in one of the interviews you had mentioned that the primary purpose of the mind is self-deception, yeah, or something of that sort, right? So I want to understand which self are we talking about, and whether the definitions will clarify that a bit better.
I surrender to the unsophistication of my own philosophical lineage when it comes to words like consciousness and mind. Because you see, the usefulness of having many different words and conceptualizations is grounded in shared experiences that give people an understanding of the nuances that are being differentiated with each word. In the West, we do not have that level of shared experiences. We are pretty blunt when it comes to introspection, and have always been. We have always, from Plato, I mean, not always, that I ask the forgiveness of Parmenides and a few others, we have not always been blunt. But since Plato, in other words, since the seminal moment of Western culture, Plato and Socrates, we have been very blunt in this regard. We do not have the sophistication of shared inner experience in order for different words to make sense. And what you see from me is an acquiescence to that. So I use the words mind and consciousness interchangeably, and I mean phenomenal consciousness with both. Why do I do that? Because look, in the West, many scholars, our highest ranking intellectuals, are incredibly, this is incredible what I'm going to say, many of them are unable to differentiate even consciousness from meta-consciousness. They can't tell the difference. For them, it's only one thing. So if this is what you're facing, how am I going to use 20 different words for subtly different states of awareness, subtle different topologies of mind, in which mind sort of turns in upon itself in subtle ways or excites itself according to different harmonics? It's like asking to not be understood, or worse yet, misunderstood. So I acquiesce to that. We do not have the cultural dictionary that you're probably from the subcontinent, I gather. So for you, this may look silly, but we just do not have that cultural inheritance, that the dictionary of shared introspective perspectives that are in India or in Pakistan and in the subcontinent in general. So I don't even try, but I do acknowledge the usefulness of all those nuanced distinctions for people who have the background necessary for that to be useful. It's just that I don't even try it. I mean, I'm fighting to differentiate consciousness from meta-consciousness. That's where we are today. Once that battle is won, and I'm not sure it will be won in my lifetime. So for me, it's like, oh man, I'm very far away from what you're looking at right now, if you know what I mean. It's like dream space.
Yeah, so the follow-up question was the self-deception.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Why do I say that mind's prime directive is to deceive itself? My motivation is direct experience. There have been a few special times in my life when you sort of, and I don't know why that happens, why in those moments I'm able to do that, while the rest of the time I'm totally not able to do that. But there are special moments when I'm, usually liminal moments, that just before awakening, or in a moment of transition in life, when your context is sort of uprooted, and in those moments you become able sort of to see through the layers of the onion in your mind, and you start realizing the exceptionally nuanced ways in which you cheat yourself. You know, the amazing ability of mind to create contraptions of deception by exploiting its own beliefs against itself, or even exploiting its own skepticism against itself. I try to write about it in part 3 of Modern Allegory, when I talk about, you know, the multi-layer deception, which is when mind realizes that it will only deceive itself if it creates a decoy for its own skepticism. And then it realizes, oh, that is nonsense, that's bullshit. And you think, okay, now I'm not deceiving myself anymore, but that place you fell back to when you saw through the deception, that is the actual deception. You know, the result of your skepticism, that is the actual deception. Look at materialism. These people think that they have seen through the deception, and reality is materialism. could you have? I mean, there are much more nuanced and sophisticated examples of that. The materialist example is a pretty crass, blunt one at this point. But once you see that, it becomes very difficult to believe in anything the mind produces other than the conclusion, it is all in mind. Everything else is a form of self-deception. And this conclusion, I have felt this conclusion a couple of times, down to my bone marrow. It's like there's absolutely no doubt about this. And it's easily accommodated by idealism. Idealism would just say, yeah, that's it. There is only one mind going on. Everything else is a play of deception. And if you would even ask me, why does mind do that? I would say, it's not even necessary for there to be a why. It does that because what it is means that it does that. It's one of its natural intrinsic properties or dispositions. For something to be anything, it needs to have some property, some disposition, and it happens to be that. But if I would allow myself to speculate further, I would say it does that because without it, there is no reality. There is just the void of being, which is probably intolerable. So mind will compulsively, desperately deceive itself in order to create reality. This is the history of creation. I mean, in India, you have all kinds of subtle, nuanced metaphors to explain that, as Brahman dropping his seed in the waters of his own dream and then being born in his own dream. I mean, that's fantastic stuff. So it's all there for the ones who can read this. But I think where we are today in Western culture, and when I say West, I don't mean geography, because Western culture now has sort of invaded the whole world. Where we are now, the territory we are exploring at this juncture in our evolution as a species is one where there is very little room for this kind of nuanced understanding of what's happening. Because people, if I say, well, mind's prime directive is to deceive itself, then people will say, oh, that means everything's an illusion and that means nothing exists. And I would say, no, precisely the opposite. It's by virtue of its self-deception that anything at all exists. It's the core of existence. It's Brahman dropping his seed in the waters of his own dream. That's how the whole thing happens. That's mind being born within mind. With the illusion that there is something outside mind, that there is a world that can be inhabited and where things can happen. I mean, even when we say things happen, I'm giving myself the freedom to go a little bit further, probably because of your background. I'm probably projecting things on you. But even the idea that things happen, nothing ever really happens if you think about that. Nothing. Because the only space there is for things to happen is the present. Things in the past are no longer happening. Things in the future haven't begun happening yet. Things can only happen in the present, but the present is infinitely small. You know, whenever you try to look at it, you can divide it in past and future. So the present isn't really there, meaning nothing ever really happens. So even this idea of things happening, you know, events hanging from a timeline, even that is a fantastic cognitive hallucination. And I think it happens because that's what mind does. mind needs there to be something for things to happen. I don't know.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sri. So we have one more hand raised, but we're out of time. So Bernardo, I'll leave it up to you.
We take if there is one more hand, I will take it. I don't want people to go frustrated.
So Corrado.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Bernardo, for being available for this sort of event. It's very helpful. I have a few questions, but I would like first to sign off a doubt that has been on my mind for a while with regard to the topic of memory, because I have this intuition that memory feels like it is a necessary step for metacognition. Of course, please correct me on that, but it feels like I can only be metaconsciously aware of things that has happened to me in a certain way. And following the avenue of trying to map what happens in my consciousness towards the possibility of how mind at large could behave, then I'm thinking, what is that parallel? What is the parallel of memory in mind at large if mind at large is instead not metaconscious? And I'm trying to link it. The doubt for me is when I try to link it also with the fundamental laws of nature. Because if it is true that those laws of nature are instead like an instinctive motion of mind at large, then where the two things do not click together for me is, doesn't instinct anyway presuppose some sort of memory for it to converge on an optimal path that supposedly is what makes the optimal, let's say, that helps the optimal state for life to emerge?
I think I understand where you're coming from, your motivation, but aren't you assuming some kind of premeditated plan? Like there is a plan for life to emerge, and then we have to run an optimization algorithm, some kind of simulated annealing that will slowly converge to this set of laws, because that's what will get us closer to the telos, to the goal.
Well, my presupposition at the moment is that what we observe as fundamental laws of nature is an instinctive motion of mind at large. Mm-hmm. So if this presupposition is wrong, of course, everything else of the reasoning is wrong. So you can also start commenting on that.
Oh, I think the laws of nature do reflect the instinctive behavior of mind at large. But you are talking about a teleological sequence whose goal is the evolution of life. So you're probably talking about the fine-tuning of the universal constants, the fact that the universal constants, which underlie the laws, are so exquisitely fine-tuned to many dozens of decimal points accuracy for there to be stars, planets, solar systems, and ultimately life. If they were to skew a tiny, infinitesimal little bit from their current values, then nothing would exist. So you seem to be presupposing that there is some kind of premeditation for setting things up the way they are so life could arise. It's a very difficult point for me. If I'm pressed against the wall to say something, I would say, no, the laws of nature are just the image of instinct, and instinct is what it is, because universal mind is what it is. It had to be something. If it exists, it has to be something. And so it happens that it's this and not anything else that we can imagine. It simply had to be something. But I am sensitive to counter arguments to this. I have a good friend who is very skeptical. Calls himself a grouchy skeptic, John Horgan from Scientific American. And I think he's also vexed by this universal fine-tuning. It's on the record that, what was his name? Christopher Hitchens was also vexed by the universal fine-tuning. I think we are all very vexed by it because it seems to suggest some kind of cosmic premeditation of a level of intelligence beyond anything we can remotely conceive. And then in that case, would it still be fair to call it instinctive? To what extent would this premeditation require metacognition? And if it requires that, why do living beings need to evolve metacognition through pain and suffering for 3.5 billion years on this planet? So these are all very difficult questions. There comes the anthropic principle and the multi-universe speculations in this picture. Where I stand today, I prefer to say we do not have a good explanation for the fine-tuning. Nonetheless, I think the laws of nature simply reflect instinctive mentation, no metacognitive premeditation of any kind. This is not the unfolding of a plan in which the planner has seen the end state. The planner is not even a planner, he's just reacting instinctively to its own unfolding. And it's reacting this way because it is what it is. It had to be something, and it is such that it reacts this way. And that's all there is to it. And then that becomes unsatisfactory because of the fine tuning. I would say the best tentative speculation for the fine tuning I have seen so far, because it leverages some empirical evidence, is that which postulates universal natural selection. And the idea is this is one of many universes. There are multiple, but not for the reasons of foundations of physics, not for the reasons that Sean Carroll says there are multiple. I think that's a sham, that's a charade, that's nonsense. But for other reasons, there may be multiple universes. The speculation continues to say that on the other end of every black hole, there is another universe in which the universal constants are slightly shuffled, like you shuffle the deck. And on the other end of every black hole, you get another universe with slightly different universal constants. Now, where the universal constants don't lead to the formation of structure, in other words, stars, planets, galaxies, and potential life, where that doesn't happen, other black holes then don't form within that universe. So that evolutionary line comes to a dead end. The only universes that sort of reproduce are the ones in which black holes are formed, so they can give rise to other universes. But then there will be a kind of natural selection that will sort of guide the value of the universal constants towards the birth of complexity, because it is from this complexity that black holes are themselves arising, you see? So this is incredibly speculative and by far most likely not true. But the question of the fine-tuning is so vexing that such a terrible alternative, such a horrible speculation, is the best game in town, if you ask me. So I don't know. I don't really know.
Thanks, Bernardo.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks so much for staying on. Especially you mentioned you have some allergies this week, which maybe made it
I feel better
trickier,
now.
but, oh, great. Yeah. I felt a bit sleepy before this, and I was like, oh, and now I feel awake. So, there's been some caffeine or coffee in what you've been discussing and what you brought up.
Second
And
wind.
thanks everyone for the great questions. And yeah, just again, deep gratitude for coming and looking forward to next week. Everyone else, do stick around if you want to continue conversations between us at some level, but just want to say thanks, Bernardo, before you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening, everybody. Take care, and until next week.
Like always, there's lots of gratitude coming in the chat.